In the early hours of New York's rise into a modern empire, one man learned that power was not taken by force alone, but by structure, timing, and control. From crowded tenements to smoke-filled back rooms, from street corners to hidden boardrooms, he watched chaos and saw opportunity. While others fought for territory, he studied systems. While rivals chased quick victories, he built networks. His rise was quiet, calculated, and relentless. Every alliance, every removal, every decision moved him closer to absolute control. This is the story of how disorder became organization, how crime became industry, and how one mind reshaped an entire underworld. Lucky Luciano's story begins not with a grand entrance but with a quiet, calculating emergence from the shadows of New York's criminal underworld. A tale of survival, ambition, and ruthless intelligence, Luciano's journey is one that blends myth with reality, showing how one man's ascent could alter the very nature of organized crime. But his legacy is far more complex than the traditional mob boss archetype. At the heart of his story is not just the world of crime, but the way he redefined it. Born Salvatore Luciano on November 24, 1897, to Italian immigrant parents, he came into the world in the bustling, crowded streets of New York City's Lower East Side, an area swarming with poverty, opportunity, and a heavy dose of crime. From a young age, Luciano understood what it meant to survive in this harsh environment. As with many immigrants of the time, he faced challenges that were both social and financial, and he quickly learned how to navigate the complicated landscape of crime that seemed to thrive in every alley and street corner. But Luciano wasn't merely a product of his environment, he was shaped by it, and in turn he shaped it. New York was a city rife with organized crime, but it was chaotic. Gangs were fractured, with no unified leadership or organization. Street crime ruled the day, and the Mafia was only a loose collection of rival factions that clashed constantly for territory and control. Luciano saw opportunity where others saw disorder. He understood the fundamental rule of the streets. Power comes from control, and control in his world meant organization. While many of his peers in the criminal world were content to work in small, localized groups, Luciano envisioned a different world. He didn't want to simply survive, he wanted to dominate. His ambition was not driven by wealth alone but by a deep, almost clinical understanding of how power could be structured to last. He wasn't merely a thug, he was a strategist. His early years, filled with small-time crimes like extortion and petty theft, were simply the building blocks of something much larger. But to understand how Luciano came to control the Mafia, it's important to look at the world that shaped him. New York in the early 1900s was a place of explosive growth, where immigrants were pouring in from every corner of Europe, including southern Italy. Many of these immigrants, like Luciano's family, came with little more than the hope for a better life. But hope alone wasn't enough. Those who found success, particularly in the immigrant communities, often did so by engaging in illegal activities, smuggling, gambling, bootlegging. As such, crime became a means of survival, and with it, a powerful system of networks and relationships grew. But as New York's underworld grew, so did the tensions within it. The streets were divided between factions led by various figures, each looking to carve out their own piece of the pie. At the same time, the police were increasingly cracking down on criminal activity, and politicians were using crime to their advantage. The tension between competing factions created a vacuum for a leader who could consolidate power, someone who could bring order to chaos. Luciano, with his ability to observe, understand, and manipulate, saw this void as his opportunity to rise. His rise, however, wasn't just about muscle. It was about brains. In the early days, Luciano aligned himself with key players in the Mafia, notably Meyer Lansky and Ben Bugsy Siegel. These alliances weren't born out of sheer friendship but out of shared ambition. Lansky, with his shrewd business acumen, and Siegel, with his boldness and ability to act when others hesitated, formed a powerful trio. Together, they were able to build a network that stretched far beyond the reaches of New York, setting the stage for what would eventually become a national criminal empire. But Luciano wasn't just a product of alliances. He also knew how to eliminate rivals. One of his most significant moves came when he orchestrated the assassination of his former mentor, Joe Masuria. This act of violence marked the end of an era of Mafia bosses who ruled through brute force and marked the beginning of a new phase in Mafia leadership, one ruled by strategy and control. By eliminating Masuria, Luciano demonstrated that he wasn't just a mobster. He was a kingpin capable of making moves that altered the landscape of organized crime. The way Luciano built his empire was, in many ways, revolutionary. While his competitors saw the Mafia as a loose conglomeration of separate criminal enterprises, Luciano understood the power of unity. He established what would later be known as the Commission, a governing body for the Mafia's various families. This structure was not only strategic but also a means of protecting the interests of all parties involved. By creating a system of cooperation, Luciano was able to ensure that every family had a stake in the larger operation, and in turn they worked to ensure the success of the entire organization. In his rise, Luciano also became adept at manipulating the political and legal systems. He realized early on that crime wasn't just about muscle, it was about control over the systems that govern society. He made deals with politicians and law enforcement, keeping them at bay while advancing his criminal empire. His business dealings were often shielded by layers of plausible deniability, with corrupt politicians and lawmen serving as his allies and keeping the authorities off his back. It was a delicate dance, one where he had to balance his relationships with various criminal factions, law enforcement, and the political class. But Luciano's genius lay not just in his strategic alliances, but in his understanding of human nature. He knew that loyalty was the cornerstone of power in the underworld, and he worked tirelessly to build a network of loyal men around him. He paid them well, treated them with respect, and ensured that they were taken care of, whether financially or through other means. Loyalty to Luciano was more than a simple matter of trust. It was a currency, one that ensured the stability of his empire. His ability to maintain this loyalty, even in the face of betrayal and violence, was what allowed him to maintain power for so long. In the end, however, Luciano's greatest asset wasn't his wealth or his alliances. It was his mind. He was not a man driven by emotion or a desire for revenge. He was, above all, a man driven by a vision, the creation of a world where he was at the top, not through brute force but through intelligence, organization, and control. His story isn't just one of a man who rose from the streets of New York to become one of the most powerful figures in organized crime. It's the story of how he outsmarted not only his enemies but the system itself. Lucky Luciano's story is one of a man who redefined what it meant to be a gangster, a leader, and a survivor. His empire was built not on the simple idea of crime, but on the vision of a more efficient, profitable, and, most importantly, durable organization. And it's this legacy, this ability to craft and maintain power, that continues to captivate us. It's a legacy built not just on violence, but on intellect and the ruthless understanding of human nature. He was, and still remains, a figure who defied the odds, outsmarted those who sought to control him, and left a mark on history that continues to resonate. What makes Luciano's story so compelling, though, is not just his rise but the price of that rise. Every empire, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually faces a reckoning. The question remains, could Luciano ever have truly escaped the life he built, or was the price of power too high to pay? His story isn't just about the heights of his success, it's about the inevitable fall that comes with being at the top, and the complex, often tragic consequences of living a life driven by ambition and control. The empire he built was a testament to his brilliance, but it was also a reflection of the human cost of absolute power. In the end, Luciano's legacy is one of duality, a master of crime who built an empire out of chaos, and a man who ultimately couldn't outrun the very system he'd helped create. Before Lucky Luciano ever rose to the apex of organized crime, the underworld he entered was far from the polished, well-oiled machine it would eventually become. The Mafia, as it existed in the early 20th century, was a chaotic, fractured network, rife with violence, personal rivalries, and territorial disputes. The world Luciano entered was not one of smooth operations or grand ambitions but one of constant conflict, where power was won through sheer force, and loyalty was often as fleeting as a bullet's flight. At the turn of the century, New York City's criminal world was a reflection of the city itself, sprawling, disorganized, and teeming with opportunity for those with the audacity to take it. The city was a boiling pot of immigrants from all over the world, many of whom turned to crime as a way to survive. Italians, Jews, Irish, each group had their own factions, each vying for control of the city's streets. But these factions were not united under one banner. They were often at war with one another, fighting over territory, influence, and profit. In this environment, crime was everywhere but lacked the coordination and structure that Luciano would one day instill in it. The Mafia was no more than a collection of loosely connected street gangs, each with its own agenda and methods. For a long time, the major players were individual gangsters or small families, often led by figures who rose through the ranks not through intelligence or strategy, but through brute force. These bosses ruled through fear, and their control was based on muscle, intimidation, and a very real willingness to kill anyone who stood in their way. But while these gangsters might have held power in the moment, their reigns were unstable, built on fear and the constant threat of violence. Loyalty was transactional. Once you were no longer useful, you were discarded. The early Mafia didn't operate like the slick, professional crime syndicates that we associate with Luciano's era. There was no central organization or overarching structure. There were no negotiations, no middlemen, no backroom deals. In this world, crime was chaotic, driven by individuals, and subject to the whims of a few power-hungry men. Every gang leader ran his operation as a separate empire, with little to no coordination between them. This lack of unity made the Mafia vulnerable to both outside forces like law enforcement and internal strife, like turf wars between rival factions. For Luciano, this disarray was an opportunity. He wasn't interested in the messy, inefficient violence that characterized much of the underworld. He saw the Mafia as a business, and businesses run on efficiency, organization, and control. While the old-school mob bosses relied on the outdated methods of brute force and fear, Luciano understood that real power came from order. He was keenly aware that crime could be more profitable, more sustainable, and more influential if it were organized like any other successful enterprise. He wanted to streamline the Mafia, eliminate the chaos, and bring about a kind of corporate structure to the criminal world, a concept that was revolutionary at the time. Before Luciano, the Mafia was controlled by figures like Giuseppe Joe the Boss, Masuria, and Salvatore Big Joe Prophesy. Both men were powerful, but their influence was based on the traditional Mafia model, fragmented, hierarchical, and based primarily on violence. Masuria, for instance, was the head of the Genovese crime family and was known for his heavy-handed tactics. He was not interested in alliances or building relationships. His goal was simple: dominate or destroy anyone who stood in his way. While he ruled with an iron fist, Masuria's reign was a reflection of the unrefined nature of the Mafia at the time. It was all about strength, and any semblance of diplomacy or strategic thinking was often cast aside in favor of direct confrontation. Similarly, Prophesy, who led the Prophesy family, operated in a similar fashion. His leadership was based on intimidation and raw power, with little regard for cooperation with rival factions. The Mafia's activities were often chaotic and disorganized, with leaders like Masuria and Prophesy engaging in constant turf wars that drained resources, killed key figures, and left the criminal world ripe for the taking. There was no long-term vision, no focus on building an empire that could outlast a single generation. It was a short-term game, one defined by bloodshed and treachery. The situation, however, was beginning to change. The early 1900s were a time of upheaval in America, and not just for the criminal world. The Prohibition era, 1920 to 1933, brought about a dramatic shift in the way that organized crime operated. With alcohol banned, the demand for illicit liquor skyrocketed. Bootlegging became the most profitable criminal enterprise of the time, and those who could supply the product reaped enormous rewards. This was the golden age of organized crime, a period when the Mafia was ready to transcend its chaotic, violent past and take on a more structured, business-like form. But this shift didn't come easily. Masuria and his contemporaries were still holding on to the old ways, controlling their territories through violence and brute force. They saw the influx of wealth brought by bootlegging as a windfall, but they didn't fully understand how to harness it in a sustainable way. Luciano, on the other hand, saw the bigger picture. He understood that bootlegging was just the beginning. The real opportunity lay in controlling not just the product but the infrastructure behind it. He saw that the Mafia could control entire industries from gambling to labor unions, and that power could be consolidated under one unified structure. By the late 1920s, Luciano was beginning to make his move. He wasn't just focused on increasing his own power, he was focused on the future of the Mafia itself. He began to form strategic alliances with men like Meyer Lansky, a brilliant Jewish gangster with a sharp mind for business, and Frank Costello, a master of diplomacy. These alliances weren't just about strength. They were about pooling resources, sharing intelligence, and creating a foundation upon which the Mafia could thrive in the long run. The idea was simple yet revolutionary: unite the fractured criminal families into a single, cohesive entity. Luciano's vision was not just to control New York, but to reshape the entire structure of organized crime in America. His plan was to create a system that eliminated the rivalries between families, creating an umbrella organization that could control the national criminal enterprise. This vision would come to fruition in the form of the Commission, a council of the Mafia's most powerful bosses that would oversee all operations and prevent the constant infighting that had plagued the underworld for so long. But before Luciano could build this new structure, he had to eliminate the old guard. The first major step in this process was the murder of Joe Masuria. Luciano, in a bold and calculated move, orchestrated Masuria's assassination, putting an end to the reign of a man who represented everything Luciano saw as wrong with the Mafia. This murder was a clear signal to the rest of the criminal world that Luciano was not only capable of extreme violence but that he was also a man of vision, someone who could think strategically, even when it meant turning on his former allies. With Masuria's death, Luciano solidified his position as one of the most powerful figures in the Mafia, but the road ahead was far from smooth. Rival factions like those led by Salvatore Maranzano were ready to fight for control. However, Luciano had already anticipated this. His ability to think several moves ahead, to understand that in war there are opportunities, allowed him to outmaneuver his opponents. By the time Luciano had succeeded in unifying the Mafia, he had transformed the criminal world into something far greater than what it had been before. No longer was it a patchwork of gangs fighting over territory. Under Luciano's rule, the Mafia became an empire, a business built on trust, efficiency, and profitability. Luciano was no longer simply a gangster. He was the mastermind behind one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations the world had ever seen. The chaotic world into which Luciano was born was gone. In its place stood something far more powerful, a force that would forever alter the course of organized crime. Salvatore Luciano's early years were far from the glamorous or mythic narrative that would later surround his name. His beginnings were rooted in the harsh realities of New York's Lower East Side, a place where the American dream often felt out of reach, especially for the children of immigrants. Born to Italian parents who had arrived in the United States seeking a better life, Luciano's formative years were marked by poverty, cultural alienation, and the daily struggles of growing up in one of the most overcrowded, crime-ridden neighborhoods in the world. The world of opportunity that America promised often seemed to be a mirage, especially for children of immigrants like Luciano, who faced immense prejudice and discrimination. From the moment he could walk, Luciano was surrounded by an environment where survival meant adapting to the harshest of conditions. New York was a melting pot, but for many, it was more of a boiling cauldron where ambition often had to be paired with a willingness to engage in morally questionable activities. Growing up, Luciano was not an exception. His early exposure to crime was almost inevitable. His neighborhood was rife with illegal activities. Street gangs, petty theft, and small-time hustles were an everyday occurrence. Young Luciano didn't just witness crime, he learned it, absorbed it, and quickly understood how the world of the streets worked. At the age of 9, Luciano was already involved in petty crime. He wasn't initially a standout figure, but he quickly proved himself to be adept at the kind of street smarts that were necessary for survival. His early brushes with the law were minor, mostly involving petty thefts or scams, but they set a pattern for a life that would eventually become defined by bigger stakes and more dangerous gambles. By the time he was a teenager, Luciano had grown more confident in his dealings with the underworld. He was already running small rackets, selling stolen goods, taking part in petty scams, and he had an acute understanding of how the underworld worked. For Luciano, it wasn't just about getting by. He was already developing an understanding of how to take advantage of the system that existed. Luciano's sharp instincts and ability to quickly learn from those around him would become some of his most valuable assets. He wasn't just a product of his environment, he was a product of his ability to navigate and exploit it. At 14, he dropped out of school and began working full-time on the streets. It was around this time that he first encountered people who would become lifelong allies, mentors, and rivals. Men like Johnny Torrio, a well-known figure in Chicago's criminal world, began to recognize Luciano's potential. Torrio, seeing Luciano's intelligence and drive, took him under his wing. This early mentorship helped shape the young man who would go on to become one of the most influential figures in the history of organized crime. Torrio's influence on Luciano was profound. The older gangster wasn't just teaching Luciano how to run scams, he was teaching him how to think. Torrio had been involved in the underworld for years and understood that success in crime wasn't just about taking what you could by force. It was about strategy. It was about understanding how power was built and how it could be consolidated. Torrio was a tactician and Luciano was a willing student. Under his tutelage, Luciano learned the value of discretion, the power of making the right alliances, and, perhaps most importantly, the importance of patience. He learned that real power wasn't always visible in the moment, it was about making decisions that would pay off in the long run. Torrio also taught Luciano about the importance of loyalty. It was one of the values that Luciano would come to internalize as he rose through the ranks of the underworld. However, Luciano's idea of loyalty wasn't rooted in blind allegiance. It was based on mutual respect and pragmatism. He wasn't the kind of man who would throw away an ally if it was convenient, but he also wasn't the kind of man to forgive betrayal. Loyalty for Luciano was a tool. It was something to be both cultivated and used. As Luciano continued to move up the ranks, his life took on a more dangerous, more serious tone. By the age of 17, he had already begun working with established figures in the New York underworld, including the infamous Gambino family. While many young men would have been content with a small-time operation, Luciano was determined to make his mark in the broader world of organized crime. He began to make connections with men who could help him realize his ambitions. People who could offer him not just business opportunities but protection, influence, and the leverage he would need to survive in an increasingly cutthroat environment. It was also during this time that Luciano became acquainted with the idea that power in the Mafia wasn't just about money, it was about control. The control of territory, of alcohol shipments, of labor unions, and even the control of political favors. By the time Luciano was in his early 20s, he had already begun to develop a vision for the future of the Mafia. He understood that the current state of disarray in the underworld wasn't sustainable. There was too much infighting, too much chaos. For Luciano, the solution wasn't just to defeat his rivals, it was to unite them under one banner. He believed that in order to dominate, the Mafia had to become a well-oiled machine, efficient, strategic, and capable of withstanding both internal and external pressure. Luciano's ambition wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about transformation. He didn't just want to be a gangster. He wanted to be a boss in a way that no one had ever been before. He wanted to consolidate power in a way that would allow him to not just control New York but the entire country. This vision, born from his early years of struggle and survival, would come to define his life. But it wasn't just about strategy, it was about timing. Luciano understood that the right move at the right time could change everything. He was calculating, patient, and always thinking ahead, setting the stage for what would eventually become the Mafia's golden age. By the time Luciano was in his mid-20s, he had already made his mark on the criminal world. His reputation was growing, and his alliances were becoming more formidable. But what truly set him apart from the other gangsters of his time was his ability to think beyond the narrow confines of street-level crime. While others were still fighting for control of small turf wars, Luciano was already laying the groundwork for an empire that would stretch far beyond the city's borders. He wasn't content to simply fight for a piece of the pie. He wanted to bake the entire pie and control every part of the process. In his early years, Luciano wasn't a traditional gangster. He wasn't prone to fits of rage or impulsive violence. He was a thinker, a planner, and a strategist. He understood that in the world he inhabited, intelligence and foresight were often more valuable than muscle and firepower. His early experiences in crime, coupled with his mentorship under figures like Johnny Torrio, shaped him into a man who would not only survive but ultimately dominate the underworld. Luciano had learned the importance of patience, loyalty, and, above all, strategy. These lessons would serve him well as he began to move closer to the moment when he would outsmart not just his rivals but the law itself. Luciano's rise wasn't marked by dramatic confrontations or flashy displays of power. Instead, it was a slow, methodical climb, built on relationships, timing, and a keen understanding of how to position himself for success. He wasn't just playing the game, he was changing the rules. As he moved through the underworld, he collected allies, built trust, and carefully laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most powerful criminal empires in history. By the time he was ready to make his move, Luciano had already crafted a vision for the future of organized crime, one that would change the Mafia forever. By the time Luciano began to rise through the criminal ranks, New York's Mafia was in need of an overhaul, a fresh approach to its chaotic structure. The old ways of running the Mafia were no longer efficient, and Luciano knew it. As his vision began to crystallize, so did his ambition, to turn the Mafia from a series of small, competing factions into a well-oiled, profitable empire. The key to this transformation wasn't in traditional Mafia rule, but in organization. It was time to bring the crime syndicates under a unified structure, one that would allow for coordination, efficiency, and a clear chain of command. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to think beyond mere power struggles. He saw the Mafia not as a collection of separate criminal enterprises, but as a business that needed structure to thrive. At the heart of this vision was a concept that was revolutionary for its time, turning organized crime into a corporation. Luciano understood that to thrive in the long run, the Mafia needed to be run like a legitimate business, with streamlined operations, clear divisions of responsibility, and a focus on profitability. For Luciano, this meant moving away from the chaotic, often violent turf wars that had marked Mafia history and instead fostering cooperation and calculated expansion. He believed that crime could be a well-oiled machine, one that was not only highly profitable but also far more sustainable in the long term. The first step in Luciano's plan was to consolidate power. He knew that the Mafia was fractured, with various factions constantly at odds, fighting for control of territories and resources. Rivalries between families were a constant source of violence and instability. This made the underworld vulnerable to both internal collapse and external forces, like law enforcement. Luciano realized that to make his vision work, he had to first unite the Mafia's fractured factions. His brilliance lay in his ability to balance alliances and rivalries, bringing together disparate factions without forcing them into direct conflict. This would be a delicate dance, and one that would require not only vision but also the manipulation of the egos and interests of the most powerful figures in the criminal world. Luciano's first major move was to break the old guard's grip on power. At the time, the Mafia's leadership was dominated by figures like Joe Masuria, who represented the old-school Mafia boss, blunt, violent, and focused on controlling territory through sheer force. Masuria's reign was based on intimidation, and his leadership was often erratic and out of touch with the changing realities of organized crime. Luciano, in contrast, was a tactician. He understood that the old ways of doing business were inefficient and ultimately unsustainable. Masuria's control over the Genovese family was not only alienating potential allies, but it was also drawing unwanted attention from law enforcement. Luciano's decision to eliminate Masuria wasn't made in haste. It was calculated, a move meant to destabilize the old guard and create a vacuum of power that he could fill. His move was brilliant in its simplicity. Luciano didn't simply kill Masuria outright. He orchestrated his assassination through a series of well-placed allies, ensuring that the operation was clean, efficient, and would send a message to the rest of the underworld. By removing Masuria, Luciano not only eliminated a major rival but also set the stage for his own ascension to the top. It was a bold and decisive move, signaling to the Mafia world that the old guard was no longer in charge. Luciano's reign had begun, but his success would depend on how he could navigate the minefield of alliances, loyalties, and rivalries that defined the Mafia. Once Masuria was out of the picture, Luciano set about consolidating his power. His next challenge was the equally formidable Salvatore Maranzano, another Mafia boss who was vying for control of New York. Unlike Masuria, Maranzano was more methodical and strategic, but his vision for the Mafia was similarly outdated. He envisioned a more traditional hierarchical organization, one based on the idea of bosses at the top, ruling over their territories like feudal lords. For Luciano, this was anathema to his vision of a more corporate structure. In this battle for control, Luciano had an advantage. He was able to unite key figures from across the various families, including future allies like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, both of whom recognized the brilliance of Luciano's vision. The battle between Luciano and Maranzano reached its climax when Luciano orchestrated Maranzano's murder in 1931, solidifying his control over the Mafia. But the removal of Masuria and Maranzano wasn't just about power. It was about creating a new world order within the underworld, a world where power was distributed not based on territory or violence, but based on business acumen, strategic alliances, and a shared interest in long-term success. One of Luciano's most important innovations was the creation of the Commission, an unprecedented governing body that would oversee the activities of the various Mafia families across the country. This was where Luciano's vision truly took shape. The Commission would serve as a kind of board of directors for the Mafia, allowing the families to resolve disputes, allocate resources, and divide profits in a way that benefited everyone. This structure allowed for a level of cooperation and coordination that had never before been possible in the Mafia world. It was a stark departure from the old ways, where each boss ruled independently, often with violent consequences. Instead, Luciano created a system where power was shared, but the direction of the whole was under his control. He had created a Mafia that was both decentralized and yet controlled from the top down. The Commission wasn't just a brilliant tactical move, it was the foundation of Luciano's empire. It gave him the ability to oversee all criminal activity without directly managing every aspect. He delegated authority to trusted allies within the different families, ensuring that they maintained control over their territories while remaining loyal to him. This system not only reduced the level of internal conflict but also allowed for more efficient decision-making. Criminal activities, from gambling to bootlegging, could now be managed at a higher level, making the Mafia more profitable and more durable. Under Luciano's rule, The Mafia was no longer a group of feuding families constantly at war with each other. It was a conglomerate, a powerful business empire that stretched far beyond New York City. Luciano's ability to manage this sprawling network was a testament to his organizational genius. He wasn't just a gangster, he was a CEO, an entrepreneur who understood the importance of scaling his operations. The Mafia under Luciano was a highly efficient, highly profitable enterprise, and Luciano himself was its mastermind. Luciano also understood that control wasn't just about keeping his allies in line, it was about expanding his reach. While other Mafia bosses were content to focus solely on their own territories, Luciano's vision was national. He began to expand the Mafia's influence into cities across the United States, including Chicago, Detroit, and even Las Vegas. His ties with Jewish and Irish gangsters like Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and others allowed him to spread his influence far beyond the Italian-American Mafia, creating a network of criminal enterprises that spanned the nation. But Luciano's transformation of the Mafia wasn't just about business, it was also about how the Mafia interacted with the outside world. He understood that to maintain power, he had to secure alliances with political figures, law enforcement, and businessmen. Luciano's ability to navigate these relationships, using bribery, extortion, and strategic influence, set him apart from his predecessors. Where they had relied on violence and intimidation, Luciano built a system where crime was hidden behind layers of respectability and legal legitimacy. His influence reached into the halls of power, and he made sure that the Mafia's activities were shielded from law enforcement scrutiny as much as possible. His vision of organized crime was one where power wasn't earned through fear alone, but through careful cultivation of relationships and strategic thinking. He knew that if the Mafia were to survive in the long term, it needed to adapt to the changing political and social landscape of America. The rise of the Commission, the spread of the Mafia into new territories, and the expansion of criminal enterprises into legitimate businesses marked the birth of a new era in organized crime, an era that Luciano had not only envisioned but created. His empire was built not just on crime but on the principles of organization, loyalty, and long-term planning. The Mafia, under Luciano's leadership, had entered a new phase, one that was ruthless, efficient, and more powerful than ever before. The Code of Omerta, an unspoken yet ironclad set of rules, would come to define the Mafia world, and Lucky Luciano was a man who understood its power like few others. Omerta, at its core, is the Mafia's law of silence, a sacred rule dictating that no member would ever cooperate with law enforcement, inform on their peers, or betray the organization. It wasn't merely a rule, it was a way of life, a code woven deeply into the fabric of the Mafia, guiding every action, every word, and every decision. To break Omerta was to invite death, and this was an idea Luciano embraced fully. He did not just adhere to the code, he used it to manipulate the very structure of the Mafia. The essence of Omerta was about loyalty, about trust in the people around you. Loyalty was the bedrock of the Mafia's power. In a world where betrayal could mean the loss of everything, loyalty was not just expected, it was demanded. It was this loyalty that allowed the Mafia to survive for as long as it did, even in the face of constant threats from law enforcement, rival gangs, and political opposition. In Luciano's world, a man's word was his bond, and his allegiance to the family was paramount. Luciano knew that in order for the Mafia to flourish, it needed a structure that was based on absolute loyalty, a bond that transcended personal gain. This made the code not just a shield against external threats but a tool for internal control. By creating an atmosphere where loyalty to the family was the highest value, Luciano ensured that his power would never be easily undermined. His vision wasn't just to dominate through sheer force but to foster a culture where loyalty was woven into every action, where betrayal wasn't just a violation of trust, it was a death sentence. But loyalty alone wasn't enough. Omerta was also about fear, a fear that had to be cultivated, maintained, and instilled in everyone, from the lowliest foot soldier to the most powerful boss. Fear was a motivator, a tool, and it was integral to Luciano's power structure. Fear kept his underlings in line and his enemies at bay. The punishment for breaking Omerta, for betraying the family or stepping out of line, was swift and final: death. This brutal, uncompromising stance on loyalty and secrecy ensured that the Mafia remained a closed system, one where information was tightly controlled and betrayal was impossible. It was within this code that Luciano operated, and it became a central element of his strategy. Omerta wasn't just about silencing witnesses, it was a psychological weapon. Those who feared the consequences of betrayal were less likely to act against the family. By establishing an environment where fear and loyalty intertwined, Luciano created a system where any deviation from the rules could lead to violent retribution. He turned the code into an instrument of control, using it to keep his enemies and allies alike in check. Yet, while loyalty and fear were the pillars of Omerta, it was the code's inherent contradictions that made it so powerful. The very thing that held the Mafia together, loyalty to the family, was also what kept its members isolated from the outside world. In a system where no one could trust anyone outside of the immediate circle, the Mafia was simultaneously a family and a fortress, a network of people bound by a code that ensured secrecy, loyalty, and absolute control. Luciano thrived in this world not just by adhering to the code, but by using it as a weapon against anyone who might try to subvert his power. But Omerta wasn't just a tool for maintaining power within the organization, it was also a means of survival. The Mafia wasn't just an underworld of crime, it was an ecosystem, one where the stakes were high and the consequences of failure were deadly. Luciano's ability to navigate this ecosystem with the efficiency of a seasoned strategist was what set him apart from his rivals. He knew that loyalty and fear alone wouldn't be enough to build a lasting empire. He needed a system that would ensure his position as a leader, not just in theory but in practice. One of the first things Luciano did was to ensure that the code was ingrained in the very culture of his operations. It wasn't just something that was taught, it was something that was experienced. He made sure that those who worked for him understood the consequences of betrayal, not just through words but through actions. The killing of those who violated the code was not just a punishment, it was a lesson. It was a message to anyone who might think about crossing him that the price for betrayal was too high to pay. But Luciano also understood the limits of fear and loyalty. He knew that people could be bought, that alliances could be shifted, and that loyalty could be eroded by a better offer. That's why he balanced his use of Omerta with a deep understanding of human nature. He wasn't just a man of fear and violence, he was a man of relationships. Luciano was a master at creating alliances, not just through intimidation but through strategic relationships. He knew that, while loyalty was critical, true power came from forging lasting connections. It was through these connections that he was able to build a criminal empire that spanned not just New York but the entire country. However, Luciano didn't just use loyalty and fear to control his men, he used them to control the entire landscape of organized crime. By creating an atmosphere where secrecy and loyalty were paramount, he ensured that his operations remained hidden from the authorities. The police and federal agencies were kept at bay not just through bribery, but through the impenetrable wall of Omerta. The Mafia wasn't just a criminal organization, it was a shadow world, a parallel society governed by its own rules, where the law didn't exist. The secretive nature of the Mafia, combined with the terrifying consequences of breaking the code, made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to infiltrate or dismantle the organization. In addition, Luciano's use of Omerta helped him expand his criminal empire without attracting too much attention. The code kept the family's operations insulated, allowing Luciano to run vast, multifaceted criminal enterprises without alerting the public or authorities to the extent of his influence. Under Luciano, the Mafia was no longer a disjointed, chaotic organization. It was a sophisticated, coordinated network, one that operated with the precision of a corporate entity. The Code of Omerta ensured that the Mafia remained an insular world, one that was nearly impossible to infiltrate. But it wasn't just the lower ranks who were expected to follow the code. Even the most powerful members of Luciano's network understood the importance of Omerta. Men like Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and others who operated in the upper echelons of the Mafia were equally bound by the code. The fact that these powerful men adhered to Omerta demonstrated how deeply ingrained the code was in the Mafia's operations. The idea of betraying one's family or disclosing information to law enforcement was unthinkable to these men, not because they feared retribution alone, but because they understood the importance of maintaining the integrity of the organization. Luciano's manipulation of Omerta wasn't just about maintaining power within his criminal network. It was also about creating a mystique around the Mafia itself. Omerta, with its brutal enforcement and absolute silence, made the Mafia seem invincible, like an impenetrable fortress. This reputation became part of the legend surrounding the Mafia, adding to the fear and respect that surrounded Luciano's name. His ability to make the code work for him wasn't just about practicalities, it was about cultivating an aura of untouchability, of invulnerability. The Mafia, under Luciano, became not just a criminal organization, but a symbol of absolute control. In this way, Luciano used the code not just to protect his empire but to elevate it. Omerta, in Luciano's hands, became a powerful tool, one that kept enemies at bay, ensured loyalty, and allowed him to manipulate both his allies and rivals alike. It was the perfect weapon for the world he inhabited, a world where information was power and silence was golden. And just as he had done with so many aspects of the Mafia, Luciano made the code work for him, ensuring that his empire would endure for years to come. As Lucky Luciano's empire grew, so did his understanding of the true mechanics of crime. He knew that to run an empire, any empire, profitability was the core. While others might have focused on brute strength, territory, and violent takeovers, Luciano was ahead of his time. He viewed crime not just as an illicit endeavor but as a business. He realized that the Mafia's activities could be streamlined, organized, and run more efficiently. Gambling, bootlegging, labor racketeering, and smuggling were not just criminal activities to him. They were industries. And like any industry, they needed structure, efficiency, and above all, a steady flow of revenue. Luciano had the foresight to understand that, just as businesses thrive on market demand and supply chains, so too could the Mafia if it operated with similar principles. In the 1920s and 1930s, the United States was a nation in flux. The economy was beginning to change, and the Prohibition era, which banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol, created a golden opportunity for those who could provide what the public still craved: liquor. With the rise of organized bootlegging, the Mafia saw its revenue streams increase exponentially. But Luciano wasn't content with just being a part of this lucrative racket. He saw that the prohibition of alcohol was a temporary fixture, a government-imposed restriction that would eventually be lifted. If he wanted the Mafia to last, he would need to think beyond the fleeting profits of bootlegging. He set his sights on expanding into other areas of crime, securing long-term success. One of Luciano's first major moves in turning crime into an industry was his realization that gambling was another highly profitable sector. In New York, gambling had always been prevalent, but it was mostly in the hands of small-time crooks, operating independently. Luciano saw the chaos in the gambling world as an opportunity to apply his business principles. The trick, he realized, was to bring organization to it, to take the fragmented gambling operations and consolidate them into a streamlined, controlled enterprise that was as efficient as any legitimate business. Under Luciano's leadership, gambling operations grew to unprecedented scales. He didn't just focus on running betting rings or operating poker games. He took control of the legal casinos, slot machines, racetracks, and lottery rings across New York and beyond. He recognized that gambling was a consistent and scalable form of income, one that could be repeated daily, with an almost endless stream of patrons looking to test their luck. Luciano was able to expand his gambling operations into other cities, ensuring that his profits were as diverse as they were substantial. He controlled all the moving pieces, setting the odds, controlling the bookies, and ensuring that the machinery of his gambling empire was running smoothly. But Luciano wasn't just focused on gambling for gambling's sake. He used it as a foundation for building further. Gambling was a cash business, and that meant it was easy to launder money. By creating a network of casinos and gambling rings, Luciano was able to filter dirty money through legitimate-looking operations. The income generated from gambling could be funneled into investments, both legal and illegal, providing the Mafia with resources to expand further. Luciano, ever the strategist, understood that every business, whether legitimate or criminal, needed to be sustainable. His control of the gambling industry was the cornerstone of a much larger plan, one that would allow him to diversify into other areas of criminal enterprise. Another key area of expansion for Luciano was labor racketeering. He understood that labor unions were powerful in America at the time. Unions controlled a large swath of the workforce, and they had significant political influence. Luciano saw an opportunity to infiltrate the unions, a move that would allow him to control not just workers, but entire industries. By bribing or coercing union leaders, Luciano was able to put Mafia men in positions of power within the labor movement. This gave him leverage over industries ranging from construction to trucking to docks and transportation. With control over the unions, Luciano could now influence entire sectors of the economy. Construction companies, for example, could be coerced into hiring Mafia-backed contractors or forced to pay a percentage of their profits to the Mafia in exchange for union support. Trucking companies, which were vital for transporting goods, could be subjected to union-imposed strikes or manipulated into paying tribute to ensure the uninterrupted flow of goods. Through labor racketeering, Luciano was able to tax the legitimate economy while staying largely out of the public eye. His influence over unions meant that he could cripple or strengthen entire industries depending on how much he was paid, turning his operations into an essential cog in the wheel of American industry. As his empire expanded, Luciano also recognized the importance of diversification. Bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering were critical to his operations, but they weren't enough. Luciano had a knack for finding new and lucrative avenues for organized crime. One such avenue was the smuggling of narcotics. While some of his contemporaries had been hesitant to get involved in the drug trade due to its associated risks and stigmas, Luciano saw it as a market ripe for exploitation. Drug trafficking had the potential for massive profits, and the demand for illegal substances like heroin, cocaine, and marijuana was growing. The narcotics trade was not only a high-risk business but one that required careful coordination and international connections. Luciano, ever the strategist, reached out to contacts in Europe and South America to secure a steady supply of narcotics. He didn't just control the distribution of drugs, he also set up smuggling routes to bring the products into the United States. His international connections helped him build a network that spanned across the Atlantic and beyond, ensuring that the Mafia would have access to a consistent supply of drugs and the infrastructure to move them across borders. One of Luciano's greatest strengths was his ability to understand and exploit the ebb and flow of demand. During Prohibition, his focus was on alcohol. In the years following the end of Prohibition, he shifted focus to gambling and narcotics. This adaptability allowed him to stay ahead of the curve, ensuring that his empire remained strong, even when certain industries were no longer as profitable as they once were. By diversifying his operations, Luciano was able to insulate his empire from the volatility of the criminal world. If one sector faltered or law enforcement cracked down on a particular racket, he had others to fall back on, ensuring his continued dominance. The key to Luciano's success in building a profitable criminal empire wasn't just his ability to spot lucrative opportunities, it was his ability to create systems that ensured efficiency. His business model was based on specialization. Each member of his organization had a clear role and responsibility. The system he built was akin to a corporate structure. Different departments handling different types of crime, each with its own leadership, but all ultimately reporting to Luciano. This specialization allowed for smoother operations, more significant profits, and a reduced likelihood of internal conflict. Luciano, unlike many of his predecessors, wasn't interested in territorial disputes. His focus was on expansion, and to expand he needed a well-oiled machine. And so, under his guidance, the Mafia went from a series of disjointed, chaotic operations to a massive, interconnected empire, unified by a single vision and overseen by one man. Luciano also understood the importance of controlling the flow of information. In any business, information is a commodity. For Luciano, information about the police, rival gangs, and political movements was just as important as the flow of cash. He built a network of informants within law enforcement, politics, and rival organizations. This network allowed him to stay a step ahead of his enemies, often receiving tips about police raids or rival gang movements before they even happened. His ability to manage information gave him a significant advantage in the world of organized crime, where knowledge of the law and rival operations could mean the difference between life and death. In the world of organized crime, power came not just from physical force but from control over resources, relationships, and markets. Luciano was adept at controlling all of these elements. He built an empire that was as sophisticated and businesslike as any legitimate corporation, making him one of the most successful crime lords in history. His ability to treat crime like a business, to build systems that ensured efficiency, and to adapt to changing circumstances allowed him to stay on top for years, ensuring that his influence over the Mafia would last long after his reign had ended. As Luciano's influence expanded, so did the complexity of his alliances and enemies. In the world of organized crime, the line between friend and foe is often blurred, with loyalty sometimes being nothing more than a temporary arrangement. As much as Luciano was a master at forging relationships and building a powerful, organized empire, he was also skilled at navigating the treacherous waters of Mafia rivalries. The world he inhabited was one of constant power struggles, and each alliance he formed could just as easily turn into a confrontation. In the early years of his rise, Luciano aligned himself with some of the most powerful figures in the criminal world, including Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and other influential gangsters. These alliances weren't just born out of necessity, they were strategic. Luciano knew that to solidify his power, he needed to bring together the most capable and resourceful figures in the Mafia. Meyer Lansky, for example, was a brilliant financier who could manage large sums of money and investments, while Frank Costello had a sharp political mind and the connections necessary to grease the wheels of influence. Together, they formed a formidable trio, with Luciano as the central force driving the Mafia's operations. But as is often the case in the world of organized crime, loyalty is tested, and rivalries can erupt even within the closest of circles. Luciano's growing power made him a target for those who felt that they were being left behind or excluded from the decision-making processes of the Mafia. One of his biggest challenges would come from his own ranks. As Luciano moved closer to total control, his rising status alienated some, especially those who saw their own power slipping away. The rivalry between Luciano and other mob bosses such as Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano was not just about territory, it was about vision. Masuria and Maranzano represented the old guard of the Mafia, a group that operated through brute force and traditional power structures. They saw Luciano as a threat to the way things had always been done, and they weren't willing to yield control without a fight. This conflict reached its zenith when Luciano orchestrated the assassinations of both Masuria and Maranzano. The elimination of these two mob bosses was not just about physical power, it was a calculated move to ensure that the future of the Mafia would align with Luciano's vision. Masuria's and Maranzano's old-fashioned approaches were now liabilities. Luciano knew that if he was to succeed in creating a more unified and efficient crime syndicate, he had to remove those who clung to the past. The public assassinations of both men were symbolic, a message to the entire Mafia world that a new era had begun. Luciano wasn't just rising to the top, he was reshaping the entire structure of organized crime. But eliminating two of the most powerful men in the Mafia didn't mean that the conflict was over. The vacuum left by Masuria and Maranzano's deaths led to even more complex rivalries. Other mob bosses saw Luciano's growing influence as a threat and began to vie for control, hoping to assert their own power in the wake of the killings. It was in these turbulent times that Luciano's political acumen, his ability to manipulate and broker deals, came to the forefront. Luciano understood that, while violence could eliminate individuals, the true path to power lay in forming strategic alliances. He used his intelligence to bring together the fractured factions of the Mafia, ensuring that even those who had once been his rivals would come to see the benefits of working under his leadership. This is where Luciano's true genius lay. He knew how to balance power with diplomacy. The Mafia was, at its core, a network of businesses, and just like any business, it required cooperation between its various branches. In Luciano's case, this meant uniting rival Mafia families and creating a more structured, less volatile system. But this wouldn't be a simple alliance of equals. Luciano made sure that his position at the top was solidified. The creation of the Commission, a governing body for the Mafia, was his crowning achievement in this regard. The Commission allowed the various Mafia families to resolve disputes without resorting to open warfare. By institutionalizing power sharing, Luciano ensured that all the major families had a seat at the table, but that he himself would hold the most influence. The formation of the Commission was a stroke of brilliance, and it was one of the key moments that set Luciano apart from other Mafia bosses. Where others would have relied on direct control, using intimidation and violence to maintain dominance, Luciano used cooperation and compromise. The creation of this governing body ensured that the Mafia, as an institution, could thrive, even in the face of internal conflict. And Luciano wasn't just an observer in this new world order, he was its architect. The Commission became the cornerstone of Luciano's power, providing a mechanism for cooperation and conflict resolution that allowed the Mafia to function like a large, coordinated organization rather than a collection of bickering factions. But power in the Mafia, like any form of power, is always fleeting. As Luciano solidified his position, he also had to contend with increasing pressure from the outside world. Law enforcement agencies, fueled by a growing sense of justice and the desire to tackle organized crime, began to focus their efforts on Luciano's operations. The federal government, led by figures like Thomas Dewey, would become his most formidable adversary. Luciano's criminal empire was vast, but so too were the resources that law enforcement could muster. The growing strength of law enforcement and the increasing public awareness of organized crime meant that Luciano's position was under constant threat. But Luciano was never a man to back down from a challenge. In fact, the pressure from law enforcement seemed to sharpen his instincts and make him even more determined to protect his empire. He knew that survival in the underworld depended on two things: adaptability and control. Luciano's ability to navigate the increasingly hostile landscape of law enforcement, media scrutiny, and rival gang activity was a testament to his resilience. He adapted his operations and created layers of protection to shield himself and his associates from the prying eyes of the law. His network of informants, political connections, and law enforcement allies became even more crucial as the government ramped up its efforts to bring him down. One of Luciano's greatest strengths was his ability to stay one step ahead of his enemies. He understood that his position in the Mafia was precarious. No matter how much power he had, there would always be threats, both from within and from the outside. This understanding led him to make alliances with key figures in law enforcement, politics, and business, ensuring that he had the support necessary to continue operating without fear of sudden disruption. His relationships with people in power allowed him to avoid the worst consequences of legal crackdowns, and even when the authorities closed in, Luciano had a knack for finding ways to stay in the game. His political savvy also extended beyond his alliances with law enforcement. Luciano's influence over politicians was another key pillar of his power. He was able to forge connections with political figures who could help shield him from prosecution or provide favors when needed. These relationships were often built on mutual benefit. Luciano could provide funding, support, or leverage to help politicians win elections, and in return, those politicians would offer protection or turn a blind eye to his criminal activities. It was a game of quid pro quo, and Luciano played it masterfully. In many ways, his relationship with politicians was a perfect example of the Mafia's infiltration into every level of society, from the streets to the highest halls of power. The combination of his internal alliances with other Mafia families, his ability to manipulate rival gangs, and his close connections with law enforcement and politicians made Luciano a nearly untouchable figure in the world of organized crime. But as the years went on, the pressure continued to mount. His once unified empire began to show signs of strain, and his own life would take unexpected turns that would challenge everything he had built. Yet despite these challenges, Luciano's ability to adapt to ever-shifting circumstances ensured that he would remain a dominant figure in the world of organized crime. His relationships with allies and enemies alike, his manipulation of power structures, and his unparalleled political cunning allowed him to continue to exert influence, even when it seemed like his empire might crumble under external pressure. But his story wasn't just one of survival. It was a story of how one man could reshape an entire criminal network, transforming it into a national and international force that would leave a lasting legacy in the annals of crime history. As Luciano's power grew, so did the intensity of the wars waged both on the streets and in the shadows. The underworld, often romanticized as a world of silent men, shadows, and codes, was in reality a brutal and often chaotic place. Power in the Mafia, as in any criminal organization, was fleeting. One moment you could be at the top, with wealth and influence at your fingertips, and the next, a rival might bring you down. Luciano was acutely aware of this dynamic, and he learned to navigate the dangers of his world with a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and strategic alliances. His rise to power wasn't without its fair share of bloodshed. The early years were marked by constant warfare, battles for territory, for control, and for dominance. At first, the Mafia was a fractured world, divided between powerful figures who controlled specific territories but had little in the way of cooperation. Each family fought for dominance over the streets, pushing their own agendas while trying to suppress or eliminate their competitors. Luciano, however, had a different vision. One where the Mafia could function like a business, where competition could be managed and profits maximized. To bring this vision to life, he first needed to eliminate his rivals, not just through violence but through strategy. The elimination of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano were pivotal moments in Luciano's rise. Both men were at the helm of the major Mafia factions in New York and represented the old guard, the traditionalists who believed in ruling through brute force. Masuria, who ran the Genovese family, was known for his violent and unpredictable nature, while Maranzano, leader of the Castellamarese clan, was more methodical but equally brutal. Luciano saw them as obstacles to his larger goal of unifying the Mafia under his leadership. Their removal, a move executed with surgical precision, sent shockwaves through the criminal world, signaling that a new era had begun. But even after his success in eliminating these two figures, Luciano's position was far from secure. Rival factions within the Mafia still posed a threat. To maintain his hold over the underworld, Luciano had to be both a diplomat and a tactician. This meant not only eliminating threats but also fostering strategic alliances that would ensure the survival of his empire. He was shrewd, making deals with rival families, forging alliances with powerful figures, and creating a system that allowed him to control the flow of information and resources across New York's underworld. He wasn't just a mob boss, he was a mastermind, navigating a complex web of loyalties, debts, and favors. But beyond the internal struggles, Luciano also had to contend with increasing pressure from law enforcement. While his dealings with other Mafia families were often behind closed doors, the law wasn't so easily swayed by backroom deals and intimidation. The rise of powerful figures like Thomas Dewey, a crusading district attorney determined to crack down on organized crime, meant that Luciano's empire would soon be threatened by external forces. For years, Luciano had managed to stay a step ahead of the authorities. He used his political connections, his network of informants, and his ability to manipulate the legal system to protect his interests. But even the most carefully constructed criminal empire has its weaknesses, and Luciano's began to show. One of the most significant threats to Luciano's power came from the government's crackdown on organized crime, particularly its efforts to dismantle his bootlegging operation. The end of Prohibition in 1933 had brought an end to the lucrative alcohol trade that had fueled much of the Mafia's wealth during the 1920s. But even with the repeal of Prohibition, the government continued to target the Mafia's activities, especially its involvement in labor racketeering, gambling, and narcotics. Luciano, ever the strategist, understood that the end of Prohibition would be a turning point in his operations. While many of his competitors were still scrambling to adjust to the new landscape, Luciano had already pivoted to other, more sustainable sources of income. Gambling, labor rackets, and narcotics would become his focus in the years to come, but the increased scrutiny from law enforcement would make these endeavors more dangerous. By the time Luciano's empire reached its zenith, the law was closing in on him. The government, particularly the federal authorities, were making significant strides in their battle against organized crime. Luciano had managed to avoid capture for years, but in 1936 his luck began to run out. He was arrested and charged with a range of crimes, from running a vast gambling empire to managing illicit narcotics operations. But the most serious charge against him was his role in the prostitution rings that were so central to his operations. Prostitution, unlike other forms of crime, was an area where public opinion and law enforcement could easily rally together, and Luciano found himself facing a determined opposition. The trial that followed was a spectacle, with the media covering every moment and fueling public interest. It was a moment of reckoning for Luciano. He had been a shadowy figure for years, with his power and influence operating largely out of sight. But now he was being thrust into the public eye, exposed to the full force of law enforcement and the media. Despite his brilliance in the world of organized crime, Luciano was not immune to the legal system. In 1936 he was found guilty and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Luciano's imprisonment marked a turning point in his life and in the history of organized crime. His time behind bars would be marked by both strategic setbacks and moments of unexpected triumph. As he languished in prison, his influence within the Mafia did not diminish. Luciano's criminal empire was not just a collection of businesses, it was a vast network, one that could function without him physically present. Luciano had built a system that was capable of operating independently, with trusted lieutenants overseeing the day-to-day operations. Even in prison, Luciano maintained his grip on the Mafia, making decisions from behind bars and continuing to run his operations with the same level of efficiency that had marked his rise. However, the government's determination to bring him down had consequences. It was clear that Luciano's influence had grown too great for the authorities to ignore. They realized that incarcerating him would not be enough to weaken his power. Luciano's relationships with politicians, law enforcement, and key figures in the underworld were too well established. So, in 1942, in a move that stunned both the criminal world and the public, Luciano was granted a shocking reprieve. In exchange for his cooperation with the U.S. military during World War II, he was released from prison and deported to Italy. The deal that led to Luciano's release was both a pragmatic and controversial decision by the government. During the war, the Mafia had become a useful ally to the American government. The U.S. military needed intelligence and logistical support, particularly in ports where Italian-American Mafia figures held sway. Luciano, with his extensive international connections and understanding of the criminal underworld, was able to provide the kind of information that was invaluable to the war effort. In exchange for his cooperation, Luciano was granted clemency. His deportation to Italy, however, marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Luciano's return to Italy was not a triumphant homecoming. Instead, it was a bittersweet return to a country that had long since forgotten him. While he still had influence in Italy, his power was no longer what it had been in the United States. The Mafia landscape in Italy had changed, and Luciano's old connections were no longer as powerful. However, he remained a respected figure in the world of organized crime, with the legacy of his empire still casting a long shadow over both American and Italian underworlds. Luciano's final years were marked by a sense of resignation. While he continued to hold some sway in criminal circles, the reality of his exile weighed heavily on him. He had spent the better part of his life building an empire, only to see it collapse around him. His health began to decline, and he was never able to return to the power he had once wielded. He died in 1962, a man who had once been the most powerful mob boss in the world, reduced to a figure in history, a symbol of the rise and fall of an empire. His story is one of ambition, power, and downfall, but also of resilience and adaptation. Luciano's ability to thrive in the ever-changing landscape of organized crime, his ability to outsmart rivals, and his unflinching drive to build an empire that was both vast and highly organized made him one of the most influential figures in the history of the Mafia. His influence can still be felt today, not just in the world of crime but in the broader cultural imagination. Luciano reshaped the Mafia into a business, turning what was once a chaotic and fragmented underworld into a finely tuned operation that rivaled even the most successful corporations. His story is a reminder that power, even in its most illicit forms, comes with a price, and that price is often paid in blood, betrayal, and eventually downfall. As the years progressed, Luciano's reign over the Mafia seemed unshakable, yet the forces of betrayal and external pressure were steadily closing in on him. His empire, built upon strategic alliances, a network of loyalists and a business-like approach to crime, was now under siege. The political and law enforcement environments had shifted drastically, and Luciano found himself at the center of a perfect storm. It was in these final years, as the walls began to close in, that the first signs of his downfall started to manifest. Luciano, once a master tactician who had built a near-impenetrable empire, now faced a more formidable enemy, the law. The government's war on organized crime was intensifying, and the establishment of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, alongside a growing public outcry against the Mafia's power, meant that Luciano's operations were under more scrutiny than ever. What had once been the Mafia's quiet dominance in the shadows was now being exposed to the harsh light of public opinion and media attention. The government, emboldened by their successes in fighting Prohibition-era crimes, now set their sights on Luciano's vast criminal empire. His illicit businesses, ranging from labor rackets to narcotics trafficking, were in their crosshairs. But while the government moved in on all sides, Luciano's power and influence did not simply evaporate. Even as the net tightened around him, he continued to operate, pulling strings from the shadows. He had built his empire with such a solid foundation that even in the face of the most intense scrutiny, his operations didn't collapse overnight. His men, though nervous about the escalating heat from law enforcement, continued to follow his orders, maintaining the appearance of business as usual. Luciano had always managed to stay one step ahead, and now, even though the authorities were on his trail, he was still able to keep many of his operations running. However, this would not last forever. The pressures mounted, and in 1936, Luciano was arrested and convicted of a host of criminal charges. The charges were numerous, from operating a large-scale gambling empire to running a massive prostitution ring. The government had successfully built a case against Luciano that seemed almost insurmountable. They were determined to break the back of the Mafia's dominance, and Luciano was their primary target. The trial was an event of great public spectacle, and Luciano was portrayed as the face of the Mafia's underworld, its boss, its brain, its beating heart. It was an image that the authorities were eager to project, as it gave their crackdown on organized crime a sense of urgency and righteousness. Luciano, the man who had once been untouchable, now faced the full weight of the law. His trial was a spectacle, a drama that played out in front of the public, with all the tensions of the underworld spilling into the courtroom. In 1936, Luciano was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison for a range of charges, including running the largest prostitution ring in the history of New York City. It was a crushing blow. For someone who had spent his life evading capture, this was the kind of punishment that could destroy everything he had built. His trial and subsequent conviction were a public humiliation, but more importantly, they signaled the collapse of a major pillar of his empire. Even though he was behind bars, Luciano had created a system that could still operate, but there was a fundamental shift now. He was no longer the omnipotent figure he had once been. The man who had orchestrated the rise of the Mafia was now a prisoner, relegated to the cell he once thought he could escape from. However, Luciano was no ordinary criminal. His mind remained sharp, and his ability to navigate difficult situations never left him. Even in prison, he continued to exert influence over the Mafia, making decisions and maintaining control over his empire. His loyalists, those who owed their position to Luciano, continued to carry out his orders. His network remained intact, and his business operations continued to churn, even though the man who had built them was no longer free. Luciano's connections within the criminal world were vast, and they allowed him to maintain a sense of control despite being physically locked away. The Mafia had been transformed by his vision into a well-organized network, capable of operating efficiently without its leader at the helm. Yet, Luciano was not content simply to run things from prison. The world around him was changing, and while his influence remained significant, he could sense that his time in the United States was coming to an end. The relentless pursuit of law enforcement and the growing pressure from outside forces meant that his empire's survival depended on more than just his influence in prison. The world he had helped shape was now beginning to erode, and it was clear that even his strategic genius couldn't change the course of the storm that was coming for him. It was during this time of intense pressure that Luciano made one of the most crucial decisions of his life. He chose to cooperate with the United States government. In exchange for leniency and a promise of release, Luciano offered his assistance in a surprising twist of fate. The U.S. government was deeply involved in World War II, and the Mafia's influence, especially in areas like New York's docks, could be an asset. The government, which had once seen Luciano as the embodiment of everything corrupt and criminal, now looked to him as a potential ally. His deep knowledge of the criminal underworld, his ability to gather intelligence, and his established networks could be valuable to the war effort. Luciano, in a rare display of pragmatism, agreed to help the United States in exchange for his freedom. This agreement, forged between Luciano and the U.S. government, was as controversial as it was pragmatic. The government had long been committed to taking down the Mafia, but now, in a time of global conflict, they saw the opportunity to use the Mafia's influence to their advantage. Luciano was released from prison in 1942 as part of this deal, and his deportation to Italy followed shortly thereafter. The deal was unprecedented and it shocked the public. The man who had once been the most powerful figure in the underworld was now a free man, not because of his cunning or ability to manipulate the system, but because the very system that had once sought to destroy him now saw him as a useful ally. But Luciano's return to Italy was not the triumphant homecoming he might have hoped for. While he had built a vast network in America, his influence in Italy was no longer what it had been. The world had changed, and Luciano found himself in a position where he had little power in his home country. The Mafia in Italy had evolved, and many of his old contacts were no longer in positions of influence. Moreover, Luciano's notoriety and the public scandal surrounding his release made it difficult for him to operate freely. The very system that had once protected him, the system of alliances and political connections, now seemed alien and distant. Despite this, Luciano remained a figure of respect in the criminal world, albeit from the periphery. He continued to influence the operations of various criminal enterprises, offering advice and maintaining connections with key figures in the Mafia. But his health, deteriorating over time, and the realities of exile weighed heavily on him. His days of commanding vast criminal empires were over, and his final years were marked by a deep sense of reflection and resignation. Luciano's exile to Italy and his subsequent life there was a stark contrast to the power and influence he had once wielded in America. The man who had once controlled the streets of New York, who had shaped the very nature of organized crime, was now a shadow of his former self. Yet even in exile his legacy endured. The system he had created, the alliances he had built, and the vision he had for the Mafia would outlast him. His time in Italy, though largely spent in relative obscurity, was a final chapter in the life of a man who had reshaped the underworld and had, for a time, held absolute power. Luciano's legacy was not one of simple crime or violence. It was a story of ambition, vision, and transformation. He had taken the chaotic, fragmented world of organized crime and turned it into a structured, efficient empire. He had created a system that transcended his personal rule, ensuring that the Mafia would remain a dominant force in criminal circles long after his death. His story is one of the rise and fall of an empire, of a man who built an empire from nothing, only to see it crumble beneath the weight of its own success. It is a reminder that, in the world of crime as in all things, power is fleeting, and that even the most brilliant minds cannot escape the consequences of their own actions. Luciano's trial was one of the most significant moments in his life in the history of the Mafia. For a man who had built an empire that stretched across the globe, running everything with strategic brilliance, the courtroom was a battleground unlike any he had faced before. It wasn't just about the charges he was facing, it was about the very public spectacle his life had become. The stakes were monumental. The media frenzy surrounding the trial ensured that it became a spectacle, a drama that drew national attention. It was a moment that would either cement his downfall or allow him to escape yet again, perhaps by slipping through the cracks as he had so many times before. The trial itself was meticulously crafted by the government. The charges against Luciano were vast, encompassing everything from racketeering and running illegal gambling and prostitution rings to being the mastermind behind a narcotics operation that spanned continents. The most significant charge, however, was his involvement in the massive prostitution network that had been a cornerstone of his operation for years. Prostitution, unlike other forms of organized crime, had a different kind of public perception. It was morally offensive to many, and law enforcement had long believed that targeting this aspect of the Mafia's business would give them the leverage they needed to bring Luciano down. As the trial unfolded, the evidence against Luciano seemed irrefutable. Witnesses came forward, and the prosecution laid out a case that painted him as the mastermind behind an enormous criminal syndicate. The authorities had spent years building a case, tracking his every move, listening to wiretaps, and bringing in informants who were eager to testify against him. To the public, Luciano appeared as the embodiment of the criminal mastermind, shrewd, calculating, and completely in control of a vast network of criminals. The media coverage painted a vivid picture of the man at the center of a sprawling, shadowy empire that manipulated everything from illegal gambling to the drug trade. Luciano, however, was not a man who would be easily defeated. Even under the intense pressure of his trial, he remained cool and calculated. In his earlier years, Luciano had mastered the art of staying several steps ahead of those who sought to bring him down, and the courtroom was no exception. He had built his empire through careful planning, alliances, and an uncanny ability to read people, and he used all of these skills during the trial to maintain his composure.